We're going to be looking at ancient Greece through the eyes of the first Roman emperor and looking at how it is that he makes use of myth for propagandistic purposes, political purposes, in order to disseminate certain ideas about his own administration through the authority of the historical, with quotes around it, past. Really, the mythical past. And that's why, as I told you on the first day, I'm getting a lot more into aspects of myth. I'm branching out, broadening the horizons of the definition, of the working definition of myth that I employ in this class, okay, as the foundation for what it is we're looking at. Rather than limit ourselves to the usual suspects, the gods and the heroes, we'll spend a lot of time paying attention to how those gods and heroes were employed in, for want of a better word, history, but in some cases, as we'll see, something in between myth and history, if not purely myth. So we start with Augustus at the very beginning of the Roman Empire. The way to situate the Roman Empire within the overall perspective in the ancient world is to think of it as the beginning of the end. Just to remind you, with the Greek stuff, you had Minoan, Mycenaean, and Dark Age. And then over here you had Archaic, Classical, and Hellenistic. Then when you go to Rome, you have the same tripartite division of Roman history. So we're starting at the beginning of that third and final part of Roman history per se. Roman history begins with monarchy, moves on to republic, and then to empire. So we are beginning today at the beginning of the end of ancient history, right? You all know about the decline and fall of the Roman Empire. Hundreds of years after this, 500 years or so, after the period we're starting with today, is the final fall of the Western Empire, continuing on in the East for another 1,000 years or so, but in the West. So we're about 27 BC right now, when we're talking about Augustus being the first of the emperors. And the question you need to ask is, how did he become emperor? And how is it, spoiler, that he ended up ruling for 37 years in a context where people who came before him lasted at the most 5 years in power, such as Julius Caesar, 5 years, until he got assassinated. Right? So that's why we're beginning with Augustus. We're beginning with Augustus because he was the most successful politician, other than maybe Alexander the Great, when it comes to staying in power. In the context of an ancient world, both Greece and Rome, where that is a giant deal, a giant accomplishment, to stay in power and not get killed. Okay? That was the rule, not the exception. As crazy as that sounds, especially when you get into later in the Roman Empire. There is a period in Roman history of about 100 years where it was pretty much a new ruler every year. So it's a giant deal that Augustus managed to rule for around 37 years. He came into power just like Alexander the Great, very young, in his late teens. So what did he do in order to keep himself from not being able to survive? The first thing you need to understand is that the empire follows the republic, and the question is, if Augustus is at the very beginning of the Roman Empire, what preceded him that led to not only Augustus coming into power as an individual, but what led to the shift from republic to empire? Okay, so to give you a little hint, Augustus embodies that transition. It is because of Augustus that that transition occurred. Without Augustus having done what he did, there would be a continuation of the republic. And that's not a good thing when you're talking about the late republic, because another nickname for the late republic is the Roman Revolution. The final 50 years of the Roman Republic, called the Late Republic, was filled with a turnover of one general after another taking power in his own hands and trying to do what Augustus did, but unsuccessfully. So what we need to do today is understand what it is that Augustus did that worked, and what he did differently from those who came before him. And the answer is use mythology. Use mythology. Say what? Well, here's the say what. Now we get into the reason why I very conspicuously left out Roman prehistory. Unlike the Athenians from post-Persian Wars Athens, around the time of Pericles, the Athenians who could look back at stories that had been told at school, the equivalent of school, and in the public domain for decades, if not centuries in some cases, about Heracles, about Perseus, about the heroes, the gods, this and that. You couldn't easily fabricate early Greek history, otherwise known as prehistory, because there were so many stories already. There was already a sense of authority in the air to what it is that I can't tell you that John Jenkins was the first president of the United States. You can't get away with it, right? I can tell you all I want, and you'd be like, yeah, right. You'd think I'm either crazy or lying, or both, right? You can't get away with that. But guess what? In Rome, you could, and you did. And that's what Augustus did. How the hell did that happen? Because unlike Greek history, say around the time of the classical period, where you could look back to an already very well attested prehistory, in Rome you couldn't do that. In Rome there was no prefabricated prehistory for you to depend on in order to assume that everybody in society is on the same page about it, and that it serves as a common story for everybody to grab onto to make them feel as though they live in the same community, however big or small that community may be. Take the Founding Fathers of the United States as an example. It is not a coincidence that we hear stories about Abe Lincoln and the cherry tree, even though pretty much everyone agrees that it's apocryphal, which is a fancy word for bullshit. Why? Because we need those stories in order to be able to point to them and say, hey, we have this in common. We need things in common in a society, in a community, in order to sustain the illusion that there is something more to it than just wanting it to be the case, that it really is a thing. So when we talk about the United States of America, oh really? How united are they? How are they united? Politically, yeah. Economically, yeah. In some other ways, maybe. But culturally, how united are they? I don't know what you listened to last night. I don't know what you watched last night. I don't know what you wrote last night or what you read last night. We don't have a clue. And it's getting more and more like that. Things are becoming less and less culturally centralized, right? To where we all can point to the same thing. We need those stories to grab onto, to remind ourselves and each other that we're all part of the same group, the same club. Why? Because, for example, wars, we need to all get together, band together, and say, hey, do we have a common enemy? And we're going to war with with that country or those countries, etc. At least that's the case with the ancient world. That was the biggest reason. All historians made it very explicit that was the biggest reason to create a sense of consensus within society. So that in the case of going to war against a foreign enemy, you're all on board. Okay? So a lot of what we're going to be dealing with is various ways that those stories were created and disseminated by the powers that be, those who have the power to disseminate the messages in a society where it's much bigger of a deal than it is now, where you have Twitter or Instagram or whatever. You didn't have that stuff then. So you had to have political power, to have the power to say something and know that the majority of citizens hear it. That's a giant deal. And if you guys are communications people, if you know Marshall McLuhan and his mentor Innes, who look at the past and interpret it from the standpoint of communication, from the standpoint of who owns the means of communication. And that's a giant deal when it comes to the dissemination of myths. And by the way, in our current context, we can very comfortably use as a kind of synonym for myth, guess what word? Meme. Yeah. Myths are memes. Myths are the first memes. The first cultural memes. If you ask Dawkins, then they have biological roots. But culturally speaking, the Greeks and the Romans were the inventors of the cultural meme. What does myth mean? It comes from an ancient Greek word, mutos, which comes from a verb, muteomai, meaning to utter, to say not necessarily a word, but to make a sound with your voice. Now, there are different ways to do that. You can do it articulately, or you can do it inarticulately. If you do it inarticulately, you're considered to be uncultured. You're considered to be a babbler. You're considered to be a barbarian. The word barbarian means that to a Greek you sound like, when you're speaking, ba 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 ba. You're a ba ba Ian. You're a ba ba person. That's what barbarian means. Nothing more, nothing less. Then, of course, it takes on connotations as the centuries and millennia go on. Okay, but that's the idea. What's the opposite of a ba ba? The opposite of a ba ba is a person who worships heroes and gods, because heroes and gods are articulate. Heroes and gods are the ideal. They're the cultural ideal. They're the ones you look up to. They're the ones in the stories that you take as examples and you teach to your kids to emulate. So there's this extremely central notion of binary division between various aspects of experience in ancient Greece and Rome. This idea of good, bad, up, down, right, wrong, absolute opposites. Okay? That all comes from the ancient world. This is not automatic stuff. This is not the idea of man, woman, the idea of whatever. Yes, you can argue that there's biological bases for things, this and that. But the very idea of associating the opposites, man, woman, with sky, earth, or earth, sky in Egypt, the one thing that is common is this whole idea of breaking things into twos, breaking things into binary opposites. Okay? And they all come down to good, bad, civilized, uncivilized. And that is the very basis for the meaning that is intended to be disseminated through the mythical memes, if you will, in ancient Greece and later Rome. So look out for those extreme contrasts. Now, what is the most conspicuous physical manifestation of the central contrast for the ancient Greeks? What is the most conspicuously physically embodied difference between what is supposed to be good and what's supposed to be bad? What's supposed to be, what represents life versus death? The symbolism of the hero. The hero represents culture, right? The hero represents why it is that people bother to get together and join together in communities in the first place, rather than being tribal, rather than being only their families, but getting together for the common good, at least theoretically. So when we talk about the importance of both gods and heroes to the Greeks and the Romans, we're talking about enlisting these symbols in order to be able to point together at them and to say these are our common currency. So what does myth mean? The first meaning for myth is word. So mythology, you guys know that logi, just like with psychology, geology, all those logi words, means the study of. So mythology is the study of words. Words that represent heroes and gods, that represent the memes that are propagated by those who are able to propagate them in order to fill the heads of the populace with them so that you get messages across. This is said straightforward, even by our boy Livy himself. Okay, so I want to contextualize Livy himself. I want to point out to you guys that Augustus' best friend, Maecenas, was to the Augustan court what the Medici were to the Renaissance. Bottom line, he's the money man. He's the guy within several centuries of progress of Roman history that led to regular old people who happen not to be born in the right families to get more and more power, not because they're born in the right family, but how? Money, of course, right? So there came to be a class in Roman society of moneymakers. Okay, from the very beginning of Roman history and Greek history, there was a stigma attached to engaging in any kind of business other than owning land and renting out parts of it so others could work on it. So another way of putting that, there was a, believe it or not, this is hard to even believe as I'm saying it, but it's true. There was a stigma attached to making money as a nobleman, as someone who's looked up to in society, okay, within that context of the writers of books like this and of Augustus and all those guys. There was a stigma attached to making money in any way other than being a boss over someone else. So that roots out a lot of us. A lot of us would be disdained by those in power in Rome because there was this idea that that was how you originally were able not only to have any power in Roman government, but even to be a citizen. It all started at the very beginning with if you own land, you're a citizen. Then it came to mean if you have a certain amount of money, you're a citizen. And that was considered to be a real revolution. That was almost like a democratic move compared to be born in the right family. There's not much you can do about whether or not you're born in the right family. There's something you can do about making money. And in ancient context, there was this sense of if you have money, you are in with the big boys who were born in the right families if you have a bunch of money. As time goes on, that becomes more the case. And Maecenas, who was not born in the right family, he's a guy whose ancestors come from outside of the area of Rome. And so Maecenas got in with Augustus within a context here at the beginning of the empire where you can have power, political power if you want it. Maecenas didn't want it, by having money and not being born in the right family. So Maecenas is the guy that Augustus relies on to use his money for the benefit of the Augustan administration in the best way he can. And according to Augustus, the best way to do that is to hire the right propagandists for Augustus to be able to swing not getting killed the way his adoptive father, you might have heard of, Julius Caesar, was killed shortly before he took the reins of power about 10 years later. So what did he do? He hired Maecenas to hire writers to come up with means that were persuasive enough to be internalized as truth by a big enough percentage of the population so that if you don't believe it, you're looked at like you're crazy. It worked. So who did he hire? Livy, the historian. But we are going to, with the benefit of thousands of years of hindsight, put quotes around historian. Then the other big-time dude who was hired by Maecenas was Virgil. And Virgil was the poet. And you don't have to put quotes around poet, because Livy lists certain historical things that occur and then says, all right, I can't do any more as a historian. Only the poets could do justice to the rest of what I have to say here. So there is a blending in the mind of especially Virgil throughout his, quote, history, unquote, between myth and history that is very overt. It's not, just one lapse on his part. He constantly makes it clear that he is quite aware that the history he's telling about the past is very tentative at best at the earliest parts of it. So let me just read you a little part of it at the very beginning of the work. It says, "The task of writing a history of our nation from Rome's earliest days fills me with misgiving, and even were I confident in the value of my work, I should hesitate to say so." Okay, so he does the usual kind of modesty or false modesty, whatever you want to call it. Then he says, "I shall have to go back more than 700 years and trace my story from its small beginnings up to those recent times when its ramifications are so vast that any adequate treatment is hardly possible." And then he says, "Events before Rome was born or thought of have come to us in old tales with more of the charm of poetry than of sound historical record." Get ready for this, okay? I don't cry wolf when I read stuff. This is heavy shit, all right? "And such traditions I propose neither to affirm nor refute. There is no reason, I feel, to object when antiquity draws no hard line. No reason to object when antiquity," meaning us, Livian and his friend, "draws no hard line between the human and the supernatural. It adds dignity to the past, and if any nation deserves the privilege of claiming a divine ancestry, that nation is our own. And so great is the glory won by the Roman people in their wars, that when they declare that Mars himself, the Roman equivalent to Ares, the god of war, was their first parent and father of the man, Romulus, who founded their city, all the nations of the world might well allow," get ready for this, the claim as readily as they accept Rome's imperial dominion. Then what does he say next? These, however, are comparatively trivial matters, and I set little store by them. I invite the reader's attention to the much more serious consideration of the kind of lives our ancestors lived. So in other words, he makes it clear at the outset that occasionally he might be making stuff up, but it's all good because what really matters is the models, the lessons that these figures from the past that may or may not really have existed provide for us now living in the present. Now that in and of itself isn't necessarily a sin. That's cool. You learn from care. But why not call it fiction the way that a tragedian does? An epic poet kind of does. Epic poet's a little bit legend. That's kind of in between. All right? Well, he doesn't go that far. He doesn't go that far, but historians in our time have. Okay? So when it comes to what Livy did in order to account for the ignorance, the collective ignorance by those in power or not in power about the prehistory of Rome, was he invented the earliest prehistory of Rome pretty much from whole cloth, out of a vacuum. Okay? Now, there were writings that came before him that he relied on for some of the facts that he used, with quotes around facts, maybe. But for the most part, historians are quite comfortable in characterizing what Livy did for the very beginning of Roman history as pretty much pure fiction. All right, now, how does he swing it, first of all? One way he swings it is he follows those earliest periods with things that occur indisputably historically, that actually have historical attestation that is uncontroversial. Okay, certain wars that Rome engaged in, whatever. So he doesn't stop there. He doesn't stop with what we today would call pretty much the mythological earliest history of Rome. He goes on from there up into for hundreds of years, thereby creating the illusion, or at least trying to, that what he starts out doing, that is telling history, is what he continues doing. Or to look at it a different way, what he ends up with at the end of his book, events that everybody acknowledges to be historical, is nothing but a continuation of what he began doing, telling the earliest parts of history. Okay. Now he admits there are little tells, throughout, like in Pope, little tells, such as he'll mention things like, all right, I'm doing the best I can, telling you what happened, but the further back, the harder it is to come to terms with the exact details. So bear with me. We'll throw that out every once in a while. But the bottom line here, let's be real, is that the early history of Rome that Livy tells is not just a series of facts taken out of the blue that follow one another, that lead up to the parts of history that are better attested. But Livy is extremely psychologically sophisticated. And he makes use of his freedom to create pretty much whatever events he wants to by creating historical figures who represent behavior that you suspect he was in cahoots with Augustus as to what it was Augustus wanted him to portray the ideal hero to be like. And it just so happened to be exactly like Augustus himself. So the founder of Rome, named Romulus, oh wow, okay, so let's get real here, right? Oh, really? Yeah, right, according to Livy, right? The founder of Rome exhibits behaviors as the first king of Rome that are suspiciously like the types of behaviors that Augustus himself projected himself as being consistent with as the first emperor of Rome. It's pure propaganda. There's no two ways about it. Okay? Now, it's ingenious, so I'm not bagging on them and saying that, how dare they, this and that. Even the most conservative of historians acknowledge this fabricated nature of early Roman history. Yet, I don't know if you know people who are way into this stuff, who talk about Roman history, how much they love it, and they look at certain aspects of Romans, you rarely hear anybody talk about this kind of stuff. They're creating a lot of myths. So what's a good example of that? Well, how about the story of Lucretia, right? So Lucretia is the wife of Collatinus, who is one of the buddies of Sextus Tarquinius, Tarquin the Proud, Tarquinius Superbus. He's the seventh and final of the Roman kings. And Lucretia, the woman, is the wife of the buddy of the son of that seventh king of Rome. Okay, so Sextus just means the sixth. All right, so it doesn't, sex, the word sex in English is from the German side of things. So it's total coincidence. So anyway, so Sextus Tarquinius is the son, and Tarquin the Proud, Tarquinius Superbus, is the father. There was that competition between Collatinus, the husband of Lucretia, and the rest of the drinking buddies about whose wife was most virtuous. And the way to test that was to go and barge in on their wives at home and to find out who was being the best wife, which in ancient Greek and Roman context means, number one, that she's at home. 100%, pretty much 100% of the time. And number two, that at home she wasn't surrounded by a bunch of her buddies, playing the cards or whatever, but actually doing something practical for the household, such as making clothes, taking care of the kids, blah, blah, blah. And the way the story goes is that they go from one house to another, and the wives are not doing what they should be doing. And then they go and they see Lucretia doing what she should be doing within that context. Okay? So right away, what does that tell you? We don't even need where the story goes to get a sense that we're already in patronized women land. Right? We're already in the world where this guy writing a quote history, now you don't mind me saying quote, writing a quote history of the way things not only really were in the early history of Rome, but should have been. He has this woman getting raped and then feeling shame for it enough to where even though her husband tells her, don't hurt yourself because of it, she kills herself out of shame for having been raped by the son of the king. Now, it's not that fact alone that constitutes what is there that is most important to learn from as a Roman. It is the wording, the way that Livy portrays all of this. Read it very carefully, and you'll see that it really comes down to a kind of implication that, from the standpoint of Livy, who really represents Augustus, who really represents, hey, all you Romans, take a look at this woman. All right? Livy's language makes it clear that despite the fact that Lucretia need not have killed herself, because it wasn't in her mind that she wanted to have sex with someone else and really commit adultery, his wording makes it clear that even though she didn't need to do it, boy, what a virtuous woman she is for having done it. Now that the fact's over, wow, what a paragon of virtue she is, right? So you see what I'm saying? There's a weird, and this is not unusual for Livy, a weird double psychology involved here. Where on the one hand, the husband makes it clear that she doesn't need to kill herself, but what's really going on is Livy is having the husband say that, so she does, so she serves as a paragon for Augustus to be able to point to her and say, hey, Romans, this is a real woman. So that's what's going on here. Okay? Now, this is not an isolated incident. I'm going to tell you something. I'm not going to do this too often. Yeah, I will, because I love this stuff. But the first book of Livy, you could do worse. The first 5 books of Livy are included in this one Penguin volume, which I really recommend the translation. Abré de Selincourt, this one. Amazon, $12 or something. The first book, and then the very beginning of the second book, it's almost all you need to know about how history was used for the purposes of mythical, meme generation and dissemination. Okay. All right, so you have Livy providing Lucretia as a paragon of virtue. And by the way, virtue, Livy himself uses virtus, the word in Latin, to describe Lucretia. Anybody know where it comes from? Anybody know Latin to where you know where virtue comes from? What does it mean for a woman to be virtuous? It means for a get ready for this. It means for a woman to be manlike. The word for man, not person, but man, in Latin is vir. So virtus is the state of being manlike. So when a woman is virtuous, she's being most like a man. What does that mean? It depends on how it's used. But it tends to mean the opposite of being hysterical. Look that etymology up, you guys. These things are out there in all the history books. But history is more than the facts that are in history books. It's also emphasis on facts, right? And in my opinion, a lot of what needs to be focused on the most in Roman history, Greek history, mythology, etc., isn't. This is the one aspect of it, this whole idea of creating these, in the case of Tarquinius Superbus, kind of straw men against which you can set up virtuous people to serve as models for the Romans. All right, so Livy provides a history, with quotes around it, of Romulus, the first king of Rome. And Virgil, who we're going to talk about next time, he creates an epic poem, the official Roman epic poem, hired also by Maecenas, and it's called the Aeneid, named after Aeneas, a hero, a Trojan, who fought against the Greeks in the Trojan War, the very first international war involving the Greeks. What we're going to get into next time is going to make a segue into the way Virgil, in his own way, does what Livy does through history with quotes around it, but in this case, through epic poetry, where he has to be a little more careful because he knows that epic poetry has the stigma of being something in between fiction and reality. So he has to be especially careful to make connections between Augustus's court and the messages he wants to send to the Roman people through his epic. Okay, so we'll start with that next time.